recording. Okay. So we're recording now. Hi, everyone. This is Jim from Nirmata, and this is the community meeting for Kyverno for January 20th. So I guess our first meeting of the new year. So happy New Year, everyone. I guess we're already well into the year, but good to see folks. So let's go ahead with some of the items we'll start with the roadmap items, and we'll go into the open discussion and talk about, some of the other things that, or if there's any other feedback or comments or items. So maybe Shooting, if you want to walk us through the release plan for 1.3.2 and some of the 1.4 effort, and then we can have other folks dive into details on their related issues.
Yep, sure. So hello everyone, this is Shooting. I'm from Namada. And as you know, we have officially released 1.3.0 last week. And now we're working on Milestone 1.3.2 and Milestone 1.4.0. There are some critical features in 1.4.0 and as well as some bug fixes will be finished and complete in 1.3.2. So there are two major items in 1.3.2 now. One is to synchronize the generated results in real time. Previously, we only sync it like every 15 minutes. And now we want to do it in real time so that whenever a generated result is changed, we want to sync the change immediately. And also, we're discussing to add a Kyverno test command, which help us to execute the test on the given set of policies and resources. Previously, we have covered this in one of our test framework, but we feel like if we can make this easier for people to add test policies and resources, it would be super helpful. So this is one of the COI command we're working on. Pooja and Venkatesh will give you details on each of those later, but the other major features in 1.4.0 is, as we planned before, we have this HA support for Kyverno to allow it running in multiple instances so that it could help moving Kyverno to a production environment and also distribute the workload and for the background controller. And the other major feature is to allow looking up data via API server. Previously, we were thinking of adding the JavaScript to support JavaScript to do some external work and then look up the data. But we feel like it may be more natural to support a custom Genius pass function to combine with this external data lookup so that it can do some basic stuff like regex match or other like simple functions. And Jim will give you some details about it later. So let's start with the items in 1.3.2. Pooja, if you want to share the status on the first issue.
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone, this is Pooja. Let's talk about the issue. So this is something now, the synchronization whenever we keep in a generate policy as enable, that is true. So if we make any changes to the source or the target source, then the changes are triggered after 15 minutes. So this should ideally be done immediately. So this is the change I am working on. So let's say we are applying a generate policy on a resource, and the generate policy have synchronization as true. And let's say it have in generate policy we are cloning one config map. So we have applied the generate policy, we have created the config map, and then we are applying a namespace. And the policy is triggered and whenever we create a new namespace. As soon as we create a new namespace, uh, the config map will be getting cloned in the newly created namespace, And this is what the generate policy is doing. After that, if we are making any changes to the source, that is the config map, the same changes should be also should be also made in the target source. So that is the generated config map in the new namespace. And this is now, it is happening whenever our sync works. And that is like 15 minutes for now, I guess. So I am working on the changes whenever we will make any changes to the config map or the source, whichever we are cloning. We can see the immediate changes in the cloned sources. So this is the one part. And the second part is, let's say we are changing the target source. So in case we are changing target source, and that is something which is conflicting the our generate policy changes. Let's say we give a replica where according to the generate policy, the replica should be 3, and user is changing the replica as 2. So that change will be overwritten, um, as we have in generate policy a different replica, and user is changing to a separate replica. So this will be overwritten, and at the end the target source will be satisfying the generate policy conditions.
Okay. Yeah, and one of the nuances with this is there could be data in a resource where the target resource may have some data that's coming from the policy, but other data that may be inserted by other controllers, right? So one of the challenges we have is we don't want to override data that's produced by other controllers, but we want to replace or realign the data that's produced by the policy. So it's
Yes.
a bit, yeah, it's a bit more involved than it seems, but the idea is that I guess with this implementation, you will be able to manage some aspects of a resource using a policy, but then other controllers could also be writing or modifying that resource, whether it's for status or other changes. So I think that it introduces quite a bit of flexibility, and the idea with this PR will be should happen in seconds instead of taking minutes like it does today.
Does it make sense to combine this as a PR with 1401, which I'll provide a link, which is similar to, but not the same type of thing? This is something that was discussed about changing the deletion behavior when a generate rule references a clone statement rather than a data statement. Again, it's not the same exact type of thing, but it's in the similar vein to the work that's going on with the generate sync behavior. Does it make sense to bundle these together or to push this out to another milestone?
So here the issue was if based on whether we were, whether it was cloned from a resource versus cloned from data in the policy, we wanted to change the delete behavior.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
because the source of truth with a clone does not lie in the policy, versus if it's a data type generate rule, the source of truth is the policy, and so it makes sense that the deletion of the policy should cascade, but not necessarily if it's a clone.
Right.
Which shouldn't be a terribly large change, but I just brought it up because this sounded familiar.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think from the implementation point of view, there's no correlation, right, between that logic, I believe, and Pooja chime in or correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is fairly decoupled, but certainly from the, yeah, I guess in the 1.4 stream, or before we get to 1.4, we would want to address these type of issues and bundle them together for generate. Yeah, I think with this, so the other impact of this would be like, so of course, if you delete the source resource, it would still delete the target resources, which here if we're removing the so but if we are, so is the issue if we remove the policy, we don't want to remove the targets?
Yes.
Okay.
If the generate rule specifies a clone type.
Right. Yeah, I think that makes sense to do, and I don't think it shouldn't be a huge change, but of course it would have to be validated, etc. Right? So
Yeah, I only bring it up because it's in the same vein. It's not the same logic, obviously, but it's in the
right.
same vein of improvements to the generation behavior.
Mhm.
In this case, to the deletion of generates, but that's the only reason why I
Right.
thought it maybe makes sense to bundle them together.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's Pooja. Maybe if you want to take a look at this and see what it takes, and we can, add some comments and schedule it accordingly. I think from a priority point of view, of course, this other resource, this issue seems, the reason why we want to put that out in a patch release is it does impact the overall usability. So of course the resource does get synchronized every 15 minutes, but that's a large time interval, right? So for something to drift away from a policy.
Yeah, that's a much higher priority item.
Right, right.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. I'll look into this issue.
Sounds good. Anything else, Pooja, on this issue? Or?
No, that's it.
Okay.
If you have any questions or someone have any other questions. Okay, I think we can proceed.
All right. Venkatesh, do you want to briefly describe the test command and where we are and what we're trying to accomplish there?
Okay, Venkatesh is not there on call, I think.
Okay, so maybe he had some network issues. Yeah, I can briefly describe, and I think most of us are familiar with, there's been some discussion on this already. But so so part of the context here, part of the history is we moved out a lot of, like the sample policies into their own repo. And, I think there's ongoing discussions, not just related to Kyverno, but in the general community about this, what happens to pod security policies. And now they're officially marked for deprecation in 1.2.1. So we're also trying to make sure that Kyverno policies are available as replacements, and there's even test coverage for those, right? So as part of all of that, one of the things which seem like for anybody writing policies, which would be great to have, is the ability to test various both success as well as failure cases for those policies. So we're initially focusing on the validation rules, but we want to expand this also to mutate and generate. And the idea is that you would be able to describe your test case using a YAML, which would say, these are the policies, these are the resources to apply the policies to, and here are the expected results from that policy. So you could, the way this would work is you would have a folder or a repo of these policies, as well as these test YAMLs with the resource YAMLs. And then the CLI, if you point the CLI to it, it would just kind of scan through, pick these up, execute the tests, and report the results. So really for anyone writing policies, or you can, as long as you structure your tests in this manner, it becomes a nice tool to use to quickly test both the success as well as failure cases for a policy, and then test against expected results that you would get when that policy executes. Now, all of this would be done through the CLI. So the idea is to decouple it from actually having a cluster, so it can be used in the CI/CD pipeline, in a CI/CD pipeline as well. But this means that then anything that would be like request data or variables would need to be passed in as arguments, or as part of this test case, you would define the various, type of data, variable data that you need. So that's some of the things that Venkatesh is working on, and we should have, prototype fairly soon. And I think this would be a good. So although it's a fairly major feature, large feature, we want to. It doesn't impact any of the existing code, so that's why it might be released as part of one of these patch releases. And what that will help us do is also improve the amount of tests we do for every build. So if somebody submits these policies and test cases, all of that will just contribute to our test suite moving forward. Any questions or thoughts on that? Or, as we're writing policies, any feedback on, like just the whole dev test process and cycle there, or what else we can think about in terms of help improving that experience?
So validate's going to be included initially, not anything else. So you would be able to check input versus output. It's just a pass or fail situation.
Correct. Yeah. So for mutate and generate, the challenge, of course, is you need to have the YAML. So that we, of course, want to cover as well. But we would have to define some syntax for how do you provide the expected result, right, for the mutated object. Whether we do it using like a JSON patch format or just the YAML format, or as an external file, we have to think through and come up with some syntax and fixtures for it. But with the validate itself, I think we can cover all the pod security policies. So that was the first goal. And then we'll expand to mutate and generate support as well.
What's the probability of the reasoning that one can do about the results from the CLI versus the actual behavior that they can expect in Kyverno? Because with that being decoupled, you're making a guess about the CLI says this, but then when it goes to Kyverno, the result could potentially be different. Like, is that a possibility, or is that? I mean, I'm just thinking. I'm thinking down the road, especially for like compliance reasons and customers that actually want to use this in a pipeline, where the CLI might tell them one thing, but there's code drift in Kyverno, and when they instantiate the policy, it doesn't have the same effect. So, is that a concern? Is that something that just wouldn't be able to happen? Like, how do you connect those two things as far as the CLI and actually running the policy?
So the CLI is Kyverno, right? So it's not a separate tool, it's not separate code, it is actually using the same policy engine. And it's really inputs versus outputs, right? So if you give the same inputs, there should be no reason why you don't get the same output. The Kyverno as a webhook is running and installed differently within clusters, of course, but it's the same code. So if you have the same version, the same inputs, the result should be the same.
Okay, so it's not just a simulator using a subset of the code base, it's the same code base. Okay.
Yeah.
There's one possibility that I can think of is if Kubernetes, like for example, if pod controllers add some defaults to the resource, and we don't do that in the CLI. So one of the example we've seen before is the tolerations. So the pod controller adds the default tolerations, but if you have some JSON patch defined for mutate policy, that will sometimes be a problem.
Right. So if there's any API machinery or anything like that, with defaulting, that could cause some differences. It is possible to even run the CLI against a cluster. So I guess but even in that case, the inputs are still coming. We're not getting an admission request in the CLI. We're, kind of creating the admission request, right?
Right.
So there would be some minor variations based on Kubernetes behaviors, but more or less wherever possible, I think, we're mimicking what happens. And it's the exact same. So once it gets to the policy engine, it's exactly the same. What happens before that could vary slightly.
Right. I'm thinking of if the user who's using the CLI can provide a cluster. Maybe we can enable the dry run mechanism to get the real data before we put into the engine or
I
something.
wonder if there's an opportunity to somehow bundle or couple this loosely to something like K3S so that it could all be run sort of in a sandbox environment. So, you know, K3S is just a single binary. It's all like CRI, Kubernetes API, all of that's bundled in the same thing. And so you could chain it so that you actually simulate what the Kubernetes API is going to do. It's just a thought on how maybe you could do that. I don't know. Yeah, that's a good point, Shooting, because that's something that I've run into multiple times where, you know, the input that you send to Kyverno is different from what Kyverno sees once the API server has manipulated it with its controllers. And there's some of that it doesn't do, but other things it does do, like service account token that I ran into. You can send a manifest in that doesn't have that, and the result, once it comes to Kyverno, is you've got a volume mounted to it. And if you didn't run that through the API server, there's no volume. So you could potentially write a policy that says ensure that no volumes are present, and the CLI would say, yep, that's valid, but when you run it in a Kubernetes environment, it's going to mutate that before it sends it to the webhooks, and then now all of a sudden you have a volume. So that would doing some sort of way to either integrate with a cluster and dry run or bundle with just as an idea with something like K3S somehow to run it in an offline fashion, just so you have that logic that's available in the processing order.
Yeah, so it is possible to test policies against any cluster, right? So you can do that already with the CLI. I think here, and it's not just the API machinery. I guess it could be any admission controller that is in the path could change things along the way before Kyverno gets to run. So yeah, it is there could be some variations like that. I think for the purposes of this test, though, again, if you're controlling the inputs and outputs, really what we want to make sure is that the policy works as expected, right? So, and it's for the person, mostly for the folks writing the tests or writing the policies itself, that they've covered all of the cases and the policy works. Now, yeah, if they want to simulate or add reference to other some API server or some other admission controller does, they can add those as additional artifacts, right? And have like a pod with that, in your example, Chip, like with the volume, the secrets volume, and without, and make sure the policy can handle both cases. But yeah, somebody would have to know what all those types of changes could be that are made along that admission control path.
Possibly adding a flag to this that would allow it to run both with the cluster, and if there is a cluster, if you have a kube context configured, to have it run with a dry run or having it run this way. Not sure how difficult that would be to implement, but if it could be done with a flag so that the process is always the same, and then it could run both with a dry run or without accordingly. May make sense also to have
Right.
the kubectl Kyverno test, whatever, and then minus the with cluster or standalone or whatever it is, have the default be standalone, but it could run then with a kubectl dry run in the backend, possibly, if that's needed for those specific types of policies.
Yeah, that's definitely possible to add, because right now, like with the apply command, you can switch that from local resources to cluster resources. The question here would be, are we using the cluster to to kind of simulate to get the resources, or are we using the cluster? So if we extract resources from the cluster, these will be existing resources that have already been created. And we could run the policy on those and produce the test results, right? So that is one option. if you're using the cluster to do the dry run for resources supplied outside, then we're just using the cluster to kind of produce the admission request. Yeah, but what we would get back is the results of the admission request, right? So we'd have to think through that a little bit more, how that could be leveraged.
Yeah, because just thinking of the CI/CD process in terms of the user that would want to build who's building the Kubernetes manifests as well, and that wants to check it against a set of policies to see that their Kubernetes manifest is validated, not running it necessarily against the actual resources itself, because if it's a validate, you could always just run it in audit mode also, and then, basically it's kind of testing it as well. But running at least on a manifest, but seeing it from the from a dry run, which would give us all of those added fields along the way, could be beneficial, I think.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I think it's definitely something we're considering, and of course it could be done. Seems like it would be an extension to what's proposed here, right? So having local resources with different combinations, and then having the ability to pass those resources to a cluster and get back the the final outputs, etc. Yeah, so and that could help with, I guess, if there's variations or variable behaviors in clusters, but that's what we'd have to think through and see how many of those use cases would need to be covered. Yeah, so I think the first step though would be, again, we're saying with controlled, as with any unit test, you want to control the inputs and outputs, and you want to kind of make sure, given a set of inputs, is it producing the expected outputs? And we can now then have different sources for those inputs and outputs, whether they're clusters or other mechanisms. All right, so yeah, maybe once we have some prototypes, let's think. But these are good suggestions, right? So we'll have to think through how we can, maybe especially to deal with some of these variations and remove that concern, like that chip, like you had, right? To say, okay, if it works from the CLI, how do I know it's going to work, also inside a cluster? Okay, so those were, yeah, right now, those are the two main issues for 132. And of course, if there's any other, critical fixes or things that come up, we'll continue looking at those. I think one other, related, issue we're also looking at is, so we have fixed most of the throttling issues for the API server. If you recall, at one point we were seeing a lot of those throttling messages. And I think the idea is to, obviously, what we did internally was move more to using caching and not doing, that happens if you're doing, I think, more than a few API server calls per second, then it starts throttling those requests. So we are continuing to look at that and see if there's any more optimizations to be made. So I think there were, it's related also to these generate resource changes and shitting. I think we already fixed most of those for the policy report, right? Or
Yeah, fixed some in the for the policy report, but I observed in the policy controller, we're still sending a bunch of API requests to the API server. So that's probably where we need to reduce the throttling as well.
okay, that sounds good. So let me actually add some notes in here. All right, so maybe while I'm doing that, Shooting, if you want to discuss the HA multi-instance, because that was the next feature.
Right. So I'm sending the HA design doc to the link if you can open it. As like we planned out in our last community meeting, HA is a important feature we want to support for Kyverno, as it'll improve the resiliency and the availability for Kyverno, and that also it can help scale background processing loads, especially when you have a large cluster. And one other problem right now with the single instance of Kyverno is that once Kyverno is down, you may lose some of the admission requests, and that is not what we expected. So obviously running Kyverno in HA is a major feature we want to support in the next major release. So Jim, can you open that design doc?
Yeah, or if you want to share, I can stop sharing as well. Go ahead.
All right, so this is the initial HA design for Kyverno. I've captured most of the major modules in Kyverno, and I've divided the HA into two phases. The first one is, phase one is what we require for Kyverno. I'll work you through each of the modules to discuss the main problem right now. And phase two is good to have, but it's not demand for Kyverno. We may want to move to another controller runtime framework so that we can enable leader election and reduce some of the works for each of the module, but phase two is, again, is not demanded for HA. So for the phase one, right now, if you scale Kyverno to multiple replicas, I'm sure you'll see the TLS arrow immediately. That's because Kyverno will always build a new certificate and register with this certificate for the webhook configurations. And that will cause the previous instance or the other instance become invalid as the certificate is no longer valid anymore. So this is the first issue we have for Kyverno, for HA. This webhook register as well as the certificate renewal. I'm thinking of doing this two together because as Chip, I think you raised another issue, is that we want to accept the custom certificate when we register during the webhook. So that's what we can do along with this change for the webhook module. And another webhook related module is the monitor we have. As some of you may know that we have a annotation on the Kyverno deployment, which indicates that whether the webhook is healthy or not. This is come from this webhook monitor module. So we periodically check the webhook status and report it as the annotation in the Kyverno deployment. And to move to the HA, we would also want to enable the leader election and make sure there is only one leader who is sending this request periodically and check the status. So the first two modules are really related to the webhook, and when it comes to the third one, the policy controller, it is the controller which periodically scan the existing resources, apply the policies to these resources, and report as a policy report. The policy report is controlled by the other controller, but this periodical scan, again, when the leader election is enabled, we can distribute the workloads between the leaders. We can switch the leaders every certain interval, and then so that we can distribute the workloads, like in this case. And then we come to the shutdown mechanism, as each of the controller will have some internal cache to cache the incoming items. So when one of the instance shuts down, we would want to make sure we have to drain the queue before this instance is shut down, so that we don't lose any of the like the objects in the queue. So for this one, what I can think of is the policy controller. Whenever we have like some existing resources, we want to process it before we shuts down, or to send it to some other instance, so that we can guarantee the item is processed, so we don't lose it. And
Do you handle that if there's a node failure underneath the pod?
I'm sorry, can you?
If you're running, let's say 2 replicas, and you've got it's a leader election, and the node which is running the pod, which is currently elected as master, that node fails, you don't have any shutdown mechanism that you can run. It's failed. So how do you guarantee processing in that case?
Yes, that's the failure recovery we were also discussing before. So for the background controller, obviously it can recover every certain interval, like it'll scan all the existing resource again. But like for the webhooks, it's really important that we need to come up with some way to make sure that the admission request will not be lost whenever the master is down.
Well, so for webhooks, there is no there's no leader or anything like that, right? So the webhooks are always sent to based on the admission path. There is a service which front ends all the pods. It'll be sent to the next available pod.
Yeah, so they're able to handle requests in parallel and not just one.
Yes.
Correct. Okay.
Yeah, for the webhook, we're running multiple instances, and there is no leader for it because the service is load balancing the traffic.
Yeah, so it sounds like that maybe there needs to be some sort of replication mechanism under the covers, so that, you know, if an admission request got sent to pod A, and then during its processing that failed, pod B that might be able to handle further processing has no ability to recover and process that request.
Yeah, so if it fails, it won't, the API server won't get back a response.
Oh, that's
it'll
right.
either
So it'll
retry,
send it
right?
again.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Never mind.
that's just all handled with the standard machinery, right? And
Okay.
I think the interesting question will be, you know, like when our default install, if we're doing with a single replica, we'll have to then document, you know, how somebody does an HA install, and even for the Helm chart, what are the few things they have to configure and change to get to an HA install based on the number of replicas they want to run. We have to decide if we want to do an autoscaler, things like that, right? So some interesting things. Once we have the basic feature working and tested, we'll have to think through about what are we, you know, recommending as a HA deployment design. Okay. Yes, I think, and Chip, you were asking in the chat on sharing the document. Yes, I think we should, Shooting, I'm not sure if this document is already public, but we can go ahead and share it if it's not. So if there's any other comments or feedback, we can, you know, receive those. But the idea would be we'll start with the initial, at least getting we'll make incremental changes. So like the certificate changes and stuff may be available in one of the patches, but then eventually when we have 1.4, by that time we should have the full HA support is what we're targeting for the 1.4.0.
Right. So the plan is to release the changes for each modules along with 1.3 patches, And until we have 1.4, we should be able to officially support HA. And I'll share this doc I'll share the link after this meeting.
All right, cool, that's good. So yeah, then the next thing, just to talk about briefly. So here, one of the things we've been looking at is for more advanced checks and lookups is how do we combine. So today we have the request data, we have config maps, but what if we want to look up some other, like labels on a namespace, or you want to look up some other configured objects, things like that. So, thinking about the options and what's available, I think one of the proposals which we already had in a prior issue, that I believe we also might have a prototype of this, is to use just in the context to be able to add more variables, and these variables reference different API resources. So it could be a list of ingresses like in this example, or could be a single ingress if you reference it based on the namespace name, things like that. So we don't want to have Kyverno sort of be open to making API server calls to any arbitrary or HTTP calls to any arbitrary endpoint, but to the API server seems valid. There are still some concerns to be worked through. Like for example, to make sure. So these calls will also get rate limited if the policies execute too frequently. So we would make sure we only load these if the variables are referenced and if the policy actually matches. So things like that we'll have to optimize versus preloading the context too often. There might be some types of resources we may be able to cache, but if they are like things like CRDs, or if there are other resources which are uncommon or not commonly used, then maybe we won't end up caching those. So there's a bunch of things to be worked through, but the general idea is to allow this type of syntax. Now, this by itself is, interesting, but I think where this gets, somewhat more exciting is what can I do with the data once I get that back? And this proposal was to say, okay, what if we allow some JavaScript? But the other option, which I've been exploring and I'm also fairly excited about now, is what you can do with JMES path, right? Because today we're mostly doing lookups on certain data, but I was reading through some articles like this one is an AWS blog, but it's talking about what sort of advanced queries and things can be done, how you can transform data. So there's a lot of possibilities, and there's also, of course, built-in functions. Like this is doing a particular, again, a query and creating, well, it's a fairly complex expression. And kubectl can do these too, because it just runs, JMES path on the JSON you return back. So the interesting thing could be you could even test and validate things through kubectl, but then you could have these type of expressions to process the data that we receive back from the API server. And then the results could be used within the policy as variables like we do today. So I think that combination is something that I'm researching more and seeing what it allows and what it can open up. But at least my initial sense is it would allow us to do quite a lot of things fairly easily without having to, just using fairly well-defined and documented standards like JMES path and, well, the API server lookup. Here you would need to know what object to look up, but it's pretty straightforward, right? You just do its namespace and the name if you want a single object, or if you don't give the name, it'll get back a list of objects for the JSON result. So that's what, it's still being researched, but looks promising so far. So I wanted to see if there are any thoughts and feedback on, adding that functionality as sort of the next step to enhance what can be done with policies and expand the use cases.
Yeah, I think that's, from what I see as far as out there, that's probably the single most valuable contribution that, or enhancement that Kyverno can make from like not from an infrastructure perspective, but from an app logic perspective, because that's really the last gap to close between Kyverno and Gatekeeper. Like that's the big thing that, I mean, there's a lot of things that Kyverno can do that Gatekeeper can't do, but the one that I see over and over again that are keeping people on Gatekeeper, regardless of the fact that they've already invested and thrown away months and years of their lives learning Rego, is the ability to look up existing items from the API.
Mm-hmm.
So that is once if that can be done in Kyverno's standard way of simplicity, which is its main value, then there's really no reason. Well, I can think of one reason really, or two reasons why people would still use Gatekeeper, but otherwise nobody would be using Gatekeeper. It's just my personal feeling there.
Yeah, and just from the potential of just expanding the set of policies, right? So certainly we have several use cases documented where we need those kind of lookups. So I agree. I think it's something worth investing time and fast tracking, and so that's why we feel that it's something that can be done, or if we can find a simple way of doing it with JMES path, at least adding this functionality in and showcasing some of the use cases would be the next step we would focus on. Okay, that's good confirmation. Any other thoughts, suggestions on that? And it combines with this other step, right? So it was where the library that's used in Golang today for JMES path doesn't support custom functions. The Python version does, but I've looked into what it would take to extend it. So if needed, we can even fork and extend. We'll try to contribute back to the library, but if they don't want to, because there's some reservation with extending JMES path to take custom functions, because it's a standard, right? So it's supposed to have a set of functions, not be customizable, but in most other languages, they have allowed custom functions just because of implementation needs. So this would help support things like, for example, if you want to look up an attribute and convert it from uppercase to lowercase, or you want to do some regex manipulation, things like that, which JMES path doesn't support. But I think that could be optional. It's more this one, even with standard JMES path, there's a lot we can do today, which is what we'll explore first. Okay, so I think we had two other items, and this was just from things carried over from on the Kyverno Slack. So let's go through those. I know we just have a few minutes left in the call, so maybe Chip, if you want to quickly discuss, this one was where we were talking about operators and condition sets, things like patterns and conditions.
Yeah, so currently today, just a level set, there are various ways that there are various mechanisms in Kyverno that can expose or work with multiples of a certain structure, and those are things like the validate.denied.conditions. There's pattern, there's any pattern, there's preconditions, there's under the match and exclude functionality for resources, there's match expressions and match labels. And all of them have their own intrinsic way of operating against multiple of the same types of data. Like they all accept an array of objects, but how they treat those objects is differently. Some of them are or, some of them are and, or maybe they're presently all and other than any pattern. But but it's a number one, it creates maybe more parameters than there really need to be. Maybe, and also it doesn't allow for some specific use cases and just some general use cases that happen to be more advanced. So what I'm suggesting that maybe we think about instead is exposing a logical operator as a label that can be nested under any of those, so that you just have one statement. So for example, you don't have pattern in any pattern, you just have pattern, and depending on the the logical operator that you expose as a subparameter, you would just say pattern.any or pattern.all, like Jim, to your point, which was a good idea, I think. And then you put your objects underneath that. And then that means that you can combine any and all statements to come up with a more complex expression. And some specific reasons why that would be valuable is in a patches 6902 JSON mutation method, you can't use conditional anchors. So that means that you have to use preconditions, and preconditions right now are always ANDed. So if you needed to do a specific mutation, like for example, to a specific index within an array, you're really limited on how you can write that the logic to apply to that. If you need to check admission review contents for different pod controllers, maybe if this label is found in any one of these 4 locations, because an admission control in James path is a specific schema location, you can't say, look for this, somewhere down from this level or star and this value. You have to be precise as far as where it's found. And you can't specify different conditions and how those should be evaluated. Also being able to do things like deny based on any sort of conditions. We've got an issue out there, like saying, ensuring that any container in a pod doesn't have their readiness probes equal to liveness probes. So there's some specific use cases that would be served by that. But in general, it does a few things outside of that. It opens up a lot of doors for more advanced, flexible, and powerful policies. It allows some of the holdovers to migrate from Gatekeeper to Kyverno, because Gatekeeper is able to do those complex expressions, by virtue of you having to program it, which obviously is a more powerful thing. But if we opened up those logical operators so that you could basically build your own expression, then that closes another gap that people would currently need Gatekeeper for. And also it eliminates the need for multiple rules that you have to write today. Like sometimes in order to get around that, you have to write multiple rules, and the second or third rule might be basically the same exact thing, but just using another, a different check, because they can't be combined in the same rules. So there's a lot of simplification that it would do, and there's a lot of doors that it would open up to build more powerful and flexible rules.
Yeah, so certainly I think the need exists, and especially for things like in preconditions, to allow that either the and or the or the any or all type of syntax. Yeah, and the question I have is, like, if we do patterns, and then, so were you thinking within like a list of patterns or within the list of preconditions, we would be able to combine like multiple and or blocks, or it would be a single like operator? And
yeah,
that,
I was thinking that you combined them, because you could say, like, for example, on a mutation, you could be able to, you could say perform X mutation if labels foo and bar exist, or if labels baz and bin exist. So you're doing ands within 2 sets, but you're doing ors across them.
so you would have something like this, and like you would have patterns, you would have and, you would have, let's say, multiple rules, and then you would also have like an or.
Right.
So it would be a more complex expression.
Right.
And you can have, okay, so, and you would run a set of rules. So then so you're saying all of everything under and would have to be, of course, do a lot, all of those would match, but, or you could have some other things, but then would you be able to nest multiple? So within the and, I guess the question is, in programming, you can have, infinite nesting, right? So you could have ands within ands. The question is, what are the use cases we want to allow and here, right? Because at some point, yeah, the idea would be, well, yes, it's verbose, and maybe there's a with writing multiple rules, but you could break things up into, just to modularize, you would break things up into rules. But so maybe let's propose some syntax and some actual use cases, and we can write up some policies and see what the options are and decide. I mean, obviously, I think yeah, it's a legitimate request for sure, and there are definite use cases where we need, especially in preconditions, right? So the question is, do we go with something like any condition and all condition as fixed tags, or do we allow this type of nesting, and how many levels, right? Or those type of things, and or is there a more general way to allow that flexibility for more complex expressions?
Yeah, I know we're running out of time, but I just add to that. What if both and or path failed? Like one of the pattern failed in and one of the patterns succeed in or. What's the behavior of that rule? Do we block? Like, let's say if the policy is set to false, do we block it or we allow it?
I mean, I haven't thought of every permutation and how that may be handled, but and maybe this is a phased approach. Like I don't think the answer has to be, well, let's allow infinite nested levels and then just don't do it if we can't do that. But maybe it is in a pattern and in any pattern there's separate tags. But I think the overarching idea is being able to build an expression that is greater than, saying here it's got to be all or nothing, or
Right.
it's everything is an and there's no way to do it. However that's implemented, I think that can be up for discussion. And yeah, there's a lot of technicalities that need to be ironed out, but the idea of being able to build expressions where today you can't really build expressions.
Okay. Yeah, so it would be great to maybe let's start a GitHub issue and capture some design ideas in there, and maybe just with if we have some examples like the preconditions one that you mentioned, we can write this out, like what would it look like, right, if we supported the OR syntax, and do it accordingly.
Sure, I'll take that.
Sounds good. Thank you. All right, and the last item we had on the list for today was this, debug mode, which I know there's also a reference issue here. So one of the challenges is there's a lot of data in this admission review, right? And so it's possible to, of course, dump out the whole admission review request, but it's large, right? So is this?
Yeah. So the way I thought, and I know that it's large, but the problem statement here is that, and we kind of touched on this earlier, that the inputs that you give to Kubernetes aren't necessarily the same
Right.
inputs that Kyverno receives. And
Yeah.
so now you're saying, well, this should work, and it's not working. Why is it not working? Oh, because it's got different things. So we've got to have a way, doesn't matter how, there's got to be a way for us to see exactly what Kyverno gets. And
Right.
the admission review payload is a way to do that. The way I thought of implementing this was to either use a CLI and just pass it a flag that's basically like an egg timer and say, starting now for the next 60 seconds, dump out the admission review payload. And once that timer expires, close that gap off. That way you're not
Right.
flooding the logs. You're not killing Kyverno with trying to dump out that JSON payload, but it
Right.
still gives you a way to, it still gives you an out to troubleshoot. And maybe that could also be a flag that's passed into the deployment. But I thought the simplest way to sort of stem the flow of thousands of lines of logs would just be an egg timer concept, like starting now for 60 seconds, write out all the admission review data that you get. After that expires, go back to your normal logging. But regardless of how that's implemented, I mean, I feel strongly that the way to enable users to use this tool better is so that they aren't guessing about how their policies, like, why isn't my policy working? The logs don't say anything. My policy looks correct. This blog article says it should work. It's not working.
Right.
So gotta have a way to introspect and find out what exactly is Kyverno getting, because that is extremely helpful and necessary in some cases.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm wondering if there's a way to just enable a trace on a particular policy, maybe by just adding a field on the policy itself, right? And but
I thought of
yeah.
that. The problem is, how do you know? You can't guarantee that the policy that you expect is going to be applying is the actual one that applies. And so I don't know of a good way to go about
Mhm.
that other than saying dump out all of the admission review data, but do it for only a certain
Right.
amount of time.
Or maybe for a certain policy, right? So, but yeah, I don't know. We'd have to. Yeah. So the question is, how do you enable, disable this? But and secondly, where should this show, right? Is it? But it would be really nice to have and the ability to just trace the sequence of execution, all the decisions that were made for a policy, and return that back somewhere. So it could be, I mean, and maybe I think we're just thinking about potential options. I mean, it could be the log. It could be even if we want to have something, yeah, maybe through the CLI, and if the CLI can listen for certain things and also show, or we can even think about like perhaps a web interface or something like that that helps with this.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of ways that this could be enhanced to really be a nice developer's tool, but I think the most immediate need and the most simple need is to just say, show me the
Show me,
admission
right?
review payload in the logs, because that way then I can
Mm-hmm.
use my existing tools to scrape logs. I can gret for them and do other, I can attach all of my tool chains to that standard out. And really, in most cases, I think that's what's needed. Just a simple show it in the logs, let me gret from there and find out, if I'm going to send a pod definition and my pod is XYZ, well, I know exactly what to gret for to return that specific payload. And then, from there, I think it's a matter of version 2, version 3, whatever. But initially, just showing that payload is incredibly helpful.
Okay, so yeah, let's think about what's the best way to enable this, because if we enable a high level of logging, there's also just tons of other data that shows up, not just from Kyverno, but also the API server and things like that, like other, or not API server, but the Kubernetes, like libraries we're using, the client go, and controller runtime, things like that, also start logging. So maybe this has to be a separate flag that we have to pass in, and based on it, we can just show the execution data. So that's where we might have some options for what exactly we want to control and show.
Yeah,
All
there's
right,
some things
yeah.
to think about.
Okay, so yeah, maybe let's, we could add this to 1.4. I think, there's definitely to help debug test policies, this would be of great value, and especially in these cases where sometimes, there's other data that you don't expect that shows up in policies or in the admission request.
Yeah, okay.
All right. Okay, so I know we're over time already, so I'm not sure if anybody had anything else, but otherwise we can, end the meeting and certainly continue discussions on Slack or other channels.
Sounds
All
good.
right. Thanks
Okay,
all.
thanks
See ya.
everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.